This video. This is a course on understanding cross-border trade. We are in section 1, risks, and this is episode 1.3, where we talk about political and geopolitical risks. Political and geopolitical risk represent some of the most volatile and far-reaching threat to the cross-border trade because they are driven by interplay of government policies, international relations, and regional instability. These may manifest as sudden barriers or asset seizures or economic isolation, and they might disrupt supply chain, erode the profit, or force the businesses to at least think about the global strategy, if not to fold up permanently. Unlike financial or legal risk, the political risk or geopolitical risk are often unpredictable, the unknown unknowns, and they are shaped by events like elections, coup, or conflict. If an European manufacturer is sourcing rare mineral from Africa, they may face supply halt due to a coup, for example, while the US firm could lose market access in Asia amid escalating trade tensions. So these are some of the things. Now, what are trade wars and what are trade tariffs? Trade wars and trade tariffs are one of the geopolitical risks. The next is the government instability, where the regime change happens, and then comes the sanctions and embargoes. These are the three major types of geopolitical risk. Trade wars arise when nations engage in retaliatory economic measures to protect domestic interest. Today, the early 2025 is a period of potential trade war brewing across the world. The perception of imbalances or assertion of geopolitical dominance is what causes the trade war. These conflicts could disrupt the global trade. They should they could disrupt the supply chain. They could disrupt the cost planning and thereby the profit realization capabilities of corporates across the globe. A trade war is an economic conflict where countries impose tariffs or quotas or other barriers in response to each other's policy preferences. They often escalate into broader disputes affecting multiple industries. The characteristic is that mostly it is a tit for tat. One country's tariff prompts reciprocal tariff. US imposes tariff on China, on solar panel, China will impose tariff on US polysilicon. Non-tariff barrier are something like restrictive regulation or subsidy or import licensing, and they do not help but hinder trade. For example, India imposed quality standards on Chinese electronics, which prevented Chinese electronics entering or flooding the country, but entering in a minor scale. Global supply chain disruption in the form of higher cost to force firm to relocate production or to absorb the losses. This is what Apple faced in the iPhone production in China. Then comes the ripple effect. Trade wars reduce global GDP. They raise the consumer prices. They slow down the investment. And almost half to 1% of the GDP will be lost or dropped due to trade tensions. What drives the trade war? Protectionism, trade balances, and geopolitical leverage. That is shielding local industries or addressing deficit in trade or balance of trade deficits or using trade as a diplomatic tool. Coming to the anatomy of trade war, there is an initial tariff and there is a retaliatory tariff, then it will cause an impact and it will may or may not get resolved. Let us look at a modern concept. Look at the US-China trade war. It not only happened in 2018 to 2020, it is happening in 2025 too. Let us look at an earlier example because the current one is still not fully played out. Now, there are tariffs on 360 billion of Chinese goods at one point in time, and they were imposed citing intellectual property theft, and it forced the technology transfer and trade deficit. What did China do? China retaliated with a tariff on 110 billion of the US goods, targeting agriculture, soya beans and pork, and manufacturing cars and aircraft parts. What is the economic impact? So 110 billion of US import was facing sanctions. 360 billion of Chinese import was facing. Chinese export to US was facing tariffs. The economic cost IMF estimated to be around 700 billion of global GDP loss. US consumers were bearing 51 billion of higher prices according to Federal Reserve. Then it caused a shift in supply chain. That is, firms like Nike and Samsung moved production to Vietnam from China to prevent the US impact. They moved to Thailand. They moved to India. So what happened? It boosted the ASEAN economies, but it raised the relocation cost. Sectoral damage. US farmers lost around 27 billion in exports, while Chinese tech firms like Huawei faced the US blacklisting. This was the impact of the US-China trade war in previous episode. 2020 phase 1, there was a deal between China and US where China committed to buy 200 billion in US good, but tensions persisted with a new tech-focused tariff. Trade war accelerate deglobalization. Trade wars accelerate deglobalization. So firms are compelled to diversify further. There was a US-EU steel and aluminium tariff-related trade war also. There was an Indo-China tensions also. In the Indo-China clash, it was actually a military or a border clash that prompted to ban Chinese social media app like TikTok and impose stricter foreign direct investment rules. What did China do? China did a limited retaliation because of India's smaller market share. But they restricted export of rare earth minerals to India, which is necessary for critical electronic component manufacturing. What are the economic and business consequences? Economic and business consequences are there is an increase in the cost of business. The prices for raw materials and components will go up. For example, US automakers incurred 1 billion in steel tariff cost. Then there is an operational cost. Firms invest in new supplier or facility. For example, Dell relocated to China from China to Taiwan. It had to spend millions on logistics. Then comes the compliance cost, navigating the tariff or getting exemptions. Regarding supply chain reconfiguration, firms adopt a China plus one policy, which we now today call as nearshoring, friendshoring, reshoring, etc. So Samsung expanded their factory capability in Vietnam and Thailand and Malaysia, etc., which is now 60% of the smartphone output, which was earlier in China. Then comes the fragmentation. Because it is not just China and China plus more, the supply chain is split into regional hub, raising complexity. EU firms source more from Turkey to bypass US tariff. Then comes the delay. Rerouting, just-in-time model may not work because of the rerouting requirement. Then is the impact in the form of consumer price inflation. Tariff will increase the retail price. The indirect cost because of the inefficiencies in the supply chain. Example, EU consumers were found to be paying 10% more for the electronics due to US-China chip shortage. And this will cause an economic slowdown because higher prices will curb demand or reduce the growth. Trade growth fell by almost 1% in 2019. The trade growth was around 4% in 2017. Then comes the market uncertainty. Firms will pause investment for expansion. Firms will find the tariff unpredictable and tread slowly. US manufacturers did cut down the capital spending by more than 1% in 2019. Then comes a competitive shift. For example, Brazil's soybean exports to China surged to 20%, 20 to 30%, which means China was buying from Brazil instead from US. So what are the mitigation strategies for the trade war? The most important thing is diversification of supply chain, multi-sourcing or regional hub or inventory buffer. Then comes utilizing free trade agreements, preferential access, leverage the FTA, or align the supply chain with the FTA rules of origin, and then explore new FTA possibilities, that is emerging FTAs like CPTPP. CPTPP came very helpful during this trade war time. What a corporate can look for is also lobbying and government engagement, that is industry coalition, join the trade groups, or direct advocacy, petition for exclusion, or a public-private dialogue, collaborate with the government on trade solutions. What else can be done is to cost pass through. If you can adjust the pricing to offset the tariffs, that you can do. Next is innovation. Find ways of reducing the cost. Develop the tariff-free alternative, or you can also work on a mitigation by way of a scenario planning, model tariff scenarios to prepare the responses appropriately. Next risk in the form of political geopolitical risk is the expropriation risk. It mostly comes during the regime change. A new government reversed the trade commitments made by the earlier government. Example, Argentina's 2029 Peronist government reimposed beef export taxes. It hurts the EU buyers when it's being exported to EU. Then civil unrest and protest, block ports, roads, or factories. Hong Kong's 2019 protest delayed 4 billion worth of exports at the port. Then expropriation and nationalization. Government will seize the foreign assets of the with a minimal compensation or no compensation. For example, the Bolivia's 2022 nationalization of Spanish utilities is very old story. The recent story in the last 4 or 5 years is what happened during the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Policy volatility, sudden regulatory shift that will disrupt the operation. This happened when the telecom taxes were applied on Vodafone in 2020 in India. What are the mechanisms of impact? One is a supply chain halt. For example, Sudan's 2023 conflict closed Port Sudan, stranding grain shipment. Or investment losses. Venezuela's oil nationalization cost ExxonMobil 1.9 billion. Or market exit. Walmart exited Argentina in 2020 amid economic turnaround. So these are the some of the things. Let us look at a case study of expropriation. In Venezuela, what happened is in 2017, 27 to 2020 or 2012, 2000, during the 5 years from 27 to 2012 in Venezuela, there was a wave of nationalizations. Under Hugo Chavez, the Venezuelan president, the nationalization of oil, telecom, steel, cement, etc. happened 27 to 2012. ConocoPhillips and Cemex faced a lot. Even ExxonMobil faced a lot of losses. The assets were seized with the promise of compensation, but mostly they were below the market value. Investor lost around 10 billion in claims. Foreign exit: Ford, GM, Colgate Palmolive, etc. claimed back or left. When they scaled back operation, they lost a lot. For example, the loss of foreign direct investment was around $2.5 billion, which came down, right? And then there is an economic collapse. Oil production fell from 3 million barrels per day to zero point 0.3, that is 1 by 10. It tripled exports. Why? Because Venezuela nationalized, but these foreign firms like ExxonMobil or ConocoPhillips were the one who were really running the show. When they exited, the production came down. So weak rule of law amplifies the risk. It requires legal and insurance safeguard. This happened again in 2022 when the Russia-Ukraine issue flared up. So, though this was called as a temporary nationalization, it forced sale of the exiting Western firms, citing economic security. And who all suffered? McDonald's, Renault, Carlsberg, etc. were the ones who suffered a lot when they had to leave Russia. So there were corporate losses, there were supply chain shifts because people shifted to Turkey, and then there was an investment chill. The foreign direct investment into Russia dropped more than 90% since 2022 due to the conflict, Russia-Ukraine conflict. The same thing happened in Myanmar in 2021 because the military coup ousted the civilian government, and then there were protests, and then there were sanctions, and then it halted 1 billion in the garment exports, and firms like H&M, Adidas, etc. had to pause the operations with Myanmar. So there are multiple mitigation strategies. One of them is a political risk insurance. It will cover expropriation risk or currency inconvertibility risk or civil unrest risk. Then you have a joint venture with a local partner so that they will share the risk and they know how to navigate the local nuances. For example, Shell has a Nigerian joint venture with NNPC. Or political leverage, a Chinese firm partnership with an Indonesian conglomerate. Then the misaligned interest will also have a problem. For example, BP's Russian venture with Rosneft faced government issues. So this has to be taken care in case of a joint venture. But in case of a political risk insurance, there will be very little exclusion for pre-existing conflict. Otherwise, you will get the payment from the claimant, it will help. Then comes a bilateral investment treaty. For example, Netherlands, Venezuela, BAT enabled Dutch firm to claim up to 1 billion. Likewise, arbitration access. UK firm used UK Argentina bid to recover losses from utility nationalization. Bid is a bilateral investment treaty. Sometimes there is a limitation. Russia's defiance of the BIT awards. Russia said they will not pay under the BIT because the situation is different. Asset light module can be done. Minimize the physical investment. For example, Amazon uses cloud based operation in volatile markets. Then comes the local engagement. Community ties with the to deter hostility by the local government or local community. Exit plan. Always have a divestment strategy. For example, Total Energy planned phased exit from Myanmar post the coup and slowly they are out. Let us look at sanctions regimes. Now, sanctions are penalties, trade bans, asset freezes, or financial restrictions which are imposed by certain governments to influence the behavior of certain other government or a corporate or a region for a particular sector or particular entity. Now, these are, for example, halting nuclear program or human rights abuse or human right trafficking and things like that. These embargoes are broader and they ban almost all trade. What are comprehensive sanctions? Because these prohibit most of the economic activity. Example is US sanction on North Korea. Then there are sectoral sanctions because they target only certain industries. Example, EU sanction on Russian oil because there is only a price cap. Then comes a smart sanction. The focus is on individual or entity like a travel ban or asset freeze. For example, Chinese officials at the Uyghur for their rights abuses, US is having sanctions on them. Then comes the secondary sanctions. This is an attempt to punish the third party who are dealing with sanctioned entities. For example, US is trying to penalize European firms trading with Iran. What are the mechanics of the impact? Market exclusion, financial isolation, and compliance burden. These are the main important mechanics of the impact of sanctions, which means sanctions will block access to the key market. Swift ban disrupted the payment mechanism, and firms had to spend billions to avoid fines of not handling the tariff barriers. What are the key enforcers? United Nations, US Office of the Assets Control, European Union are the key imposers of the sanction. Iran sanctions is a very popular case study, while Russian sanctions of 22 is what is happening in the current world. That is what we should be looking at. Now, mitigation strategy for sanctions could be in the form of robust compliance preparedness or alternative channels like non-USD payment, for example, for certain countries or certain jurisdictions. And then comes the legal contingency planning, where what sanctions clause you will have invoked, what will happen in case of a force majeure, because the Canadian supplier, if they want to invoke a force majeure to halt the Iranian shipment, how it could be done? Or a French firm want to exit a Russian deal penalty free due to the current ban, how it can be done. So you need to have a contingency planning in the form of risk mitigation for the sanctions. Finally, the sanctions are one form of geopolitical risk. There are other political risks that stem from the respective countries' political decisions, and so there is a need for every corporate to monitor the developments from the policy side due to political changes in every country that they operate. Companies also need to have capability to have resilient operations. That means they have to build alternatives to diversify their choices of sources and sales. They also need to implement defensive measures like political insurance coverage or the clauses in their contracts. The trade wars, the government instability, the sanctions, these do pose profound challenges in international trade. They do demand agility and foresight because they have capability to disrupt the supply chain, raise the cost, and complicate the conflict. So there is a need for diversification, need for encouraging free trade agreement, need to exploit the bilateral relationship between the governments. The sanctions and embargo isolate the markets. So the corporates need to adopt diversified strategies, securing legal protection and monitor the global trend. Today, with the help of AI-driven technology and tools, it is easier to be a little bit more proactive diplomatically, and this could help in building resilience. Thanks for watching this video. We shall meet again in the next episode.